Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11A reading selection review for today. Now, we just finished working on Poetry in the Age of Reason and reviewing some of the pieces of literature that were there. So now we're moving on to the next lesson, which should be lesson number 5 from Unit 1 of English 11A, which is literature during the American Revolution. So we're actually just going to dive right in. There's only one major excerpt or piece of writing that we're reviewing. It is located, I will tell you in advance, it is located on slide 15 of the tutorial. So have said this in previous videos, but it's important for all of you to make sure that you review the material in the tutorial at least once before watching this video. I definitely skip ahead. We have other videos that are just for walking through the information that's in the tutorial without the reading selections. So if you just need help with getting past the first few slides, I would start there. But if you need help with understanding the excerpt of this lesson, which is The Crisis Number 1 by Thomas Paine, you are in the right place and we will get you that help. So I am going to dive in and get started by sharing my screen. Oh, you know what? Before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that if you were forwarded this video and you think you need the other video going over the entire tutorial from start to finish, I would consider contacting your mentor, your teacher, or your advocate so that they can give you the links to the live lessons that cover just the tutorial information. The entire point of the reading selection review is to help students that are okay with understanding what's in the tutorial, but have a hard time with understanding the reading selection specifically. Sometimes they're written in older language. Sometimes there's just a lot of arguments being made or points being made, or there's a lot of flowery language that's difficult to break down. And that's what the point of these lessons are. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. We're hopping directly into the tutorial. I'm going to move myself up here. So I'm starting on slide 14, only because slide 14 gives you information about Thomas Paine and the circumstances of this piece of writing. It's always important to review the history on a piece of writing because the issues that happened at the time or that were important to people who were alive at the time are entirely the reason why some things get written. So when they give you background information, sometimes you can make guesses on things that will be in the text or what the text will be about based on what's going on in the information here. Sometimes if you get information about the writer, that can also influence things that are in the story. So like if you're dealing with a writer who you know had like a difficult childhood, you may have some themes about difficult family dynamics in their writing and things like that. Now we're just going to review this really quickly. You can pause this video to read through it on your own, but I'm just going to go over just a couple points. So we start off in this first sentence. They tell you who Thomas Paine is. He was a revolutionary writer from Britain. So he was pro the Revolutionary War. So he came to the colonies after meeting Benjamin Franklin in 1774. He's known for writing the pamphlet Common Sense in 1776. Which challenged what he believed to be the injustices of monarchies and hereditary rule. So basically, he was arguing monarchies are weird, they're not right, they're just in place so that the powerful can stay powerful and consolidate power. Here are the reasons why I don't think that monarchies actually work, and why I think they're not held accountable for the things that they do. And furthermore, why I think we don't need a monarchy here in America. So his writing was very important. It was a major factor leading to the Declaration of Independence. So he helped to make people feel bolder about speaking out against Britain and King George, and just wanting to be free from the influence of Britain. And just moving down a little bit more, General George Washington ordered that he write the essay, The Crisis Number One, to be read to the Continental. I'm sorry, that his first essay um, in American Crisis. This was another thing that Thomas Paine wrote. General George Washington ordered that it be read to the Continental Army before the Battle of Trenton to raise the soldiers' spirits and inspire them to fight. What's important to note here, and they give you this information a little further up, Paine traveled with the Continental Army to report on its progress. And this is what led for him to write Crisis Number One, to try to encourage people to have faith in what they were fighting for America's freedom, and also just to not abandon the war, even though there were kind of high losses and a lot of difficult situations that people were being put in. Now, here at the bottom, they note that Paine differed from many writers in the Age of Reason because he directly addressed common people instead of the educated elite, and his language was straightforward. So this kind of gave off the idea that all people were capable of understanding politics and government. So he wrote in a very straightforward manner and assumed that his readership, even if they weren't high elite educated people, could understand what he was saying. And he believed that the average man should have knowledge of things that were happening so that they could make informed decisions. And then here, just to finish it off, he was a man without a lot of wealth, education, or status himself. So he believed that America was a place where people who came from not high-born backgrounds like himself could actually be successful. So he's definitely one of the proponents of the idea of the American dream, like that early on, before it was fully a thing. He believed that you could make your fate in America, and that was very important. They were fighting for the existence of a place where that was possible. Now on slide 15, they give you a few things, right? So they give you a strategy for reading. And the strategy is basically just to keep organized, right? They want you to try to track the arguments that are being made in this text. And then they give you a couple of ways to do this. One way to track arguments is by making a chart that lists the claim, the supporting piece of evidence, and the type of appeal. Now, if you are not familiar with different types of appeal, these were discussed in some of the knowledge articles and slides from the colonial literature lesson. Now, the different types of appeals are appeal to authority. So you're appealing to like ethics and what people think is the correct thing to do. That's ethos. You can appeal to emotions, which is pathos. And then you can appeal to logic and reasoning, which is creating step-by-step arguments that lead into each other, and that's logos. So yes, appeal to authority, that's like ethics, things that we think are right, and I forgot to mention this, but also sources and credibility. So in general, credibility is your basically your integrity as a person. So ethos encompasses appealing to things that are generally universally agreed to be the right thing, or because credibility, an expert who's giving you information directly based on what they know. So these are two different types of credibility. It's your credibility as a person or your credibility as an expert on the topic. Those are both different types of credibility. Pathos is emotion, just to review again. And then the last one is logos, which is when you're making a logical argument. Because XYZ is happening and the effect is blank, I think we should do XYZ. You're actually putting an argument together that someone should be able to follow, even if they don't know a whole lot about the topic. So it's important to take note of which arguments are being made and the types of evidence that are being used. Are they giving you an anecdote? Are they giving you statistics, which are numbers? Are they giving you facts? Like, did you do your research? And there are other types of evidence as well. If you're here in this lesson and you don't know what types of arguments or what types of evidence exist, I would definitely go back to the colonial literature tutorial and look at the knowledge article. It was covered by me with some of the the reading selections for that lesson. So if you got this specific lesson from the spreadsheet um, that has all of the lessons in them, you can just go back up a few cells and it should be listed higher up on the list. So they give you a couple of things that you can focus on reading here. It says, consider the following questions and use the table to track arguments and evidence. So this isn't something that you have to do for a grade, but it will help you with answering questions, not just in the lesson for the lesson activities, but it's very likely that the mastery test is going to have questions about these things. So here are the things they want you to focus on. What is Paine's main argument in the crisis number 1? What type of evidence do you notice to support his argument? How does Paine's use of different kinds of evidence, that's what we were talking about, support his claims? How does Paine convey his opinion? How do his tone and word choices indicate that he is trying to persuade the reader to agree with him? And the first line of Paine's essay, these are the times that try men's souls, is one of the most famous of the American Revolution. So what does Paine mean by this statement? So this is the first line. He's talking about the American Revolution and the difficulties that have transpired for people who are fighting and dealing with the conflict of the war. So they want to know, after you finish reading the entire excerpt, what do you think he means by that? Sometimes it's easier to come back and answer questions after you've read the whole thing. This is the first line of the essay. So if you just read it on its own, you won't know what he's talking about. So I think it's better for you to try to answer that question after we get to the end. Now, the assignments are going to ask you different questions about the information that's in this paragraph. I want to make it very, not paragraph, this excerpt. I want to make it very clear that while I'm going over the information that's in the excerpt and translating it so that it's more easily understandable, I am not answering those questions for you. The goal of these videos is to help give a little boost to people who have a difficult time understanding the arguments that are being made. Once you understand what the language is saying, you should have an easier time answering the questions yourself. It's really hard to answer questions about a text if you don't know what the text is saying. So that's the point of these reading selection reviews. Now, they give you an example of one of the arguments that are tracked. And they do actually use an excerpt from the crisis number 1, like a quote. So this is one of the main ideas or arguments that are made, one of. So there are a lot. This is not the only one. So you cannot use this to answer every single question about the text. So this says, I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. So that's kind of a statement in and of itself. That's kind of easy to understand. He doesn't know of any way to judge the future but by the past. You can only use the past to make predictions about the future. Judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct or behavior of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have to be pleased to solace themselves and the house. So what he's saying here is, judging by the past, what has the British ministry or government done in the last 10 years to justify the hopes that people have that the British will be kind to the US after the revolution is over? Now remember, this is basically this was a speech or a piece of writing that was asked to be read to people at a convention to help inspire more people to volunteer as soldiers to help with the war, right? Things were getting difficult. They needed more bodies to fight. So he's making the argument here that for the people who don't support the war, that think that everything is just going to blow over, what have the British done in the last decade, the last 10 years, that makes them think that after the American Revolution is over, regardless of if they win or lose, that Britain is going to be nice to the people who are left over? So this is a very clear argument, right? He's making comparisons to the past. These are things that are actual facts, like the things that have happened are things that you can actually discuss and observe, right? So that's why here, for supporting evidence, it says Paine makes comparisons to the past and reflects on previous events and bases his claims on the events of the past 10 years. So these are things that we know to be true because people have lived through and experienced them. You can't really deny things that have happened that everybody knows happened. So he's saying, look at that. If they were harsh to us before the war started, and they weren't trying to make life easier for us before the war started, why do you have faith that this would happen if we lose the war or if we decide not to fight the British? And that type of appeal, that evidence that he's making, is an anecdotal appeal. So anecdotal is when you tell a true story that is an example of the argument that you are trying to make. So this is an anecdotal appeal. So he refers to events that have occurred in the recent past to appeal to his readers' emotions and remind them of how they have been negatively affected by the British government. So this is kind of how they want you to try to keep track of the arguments that are in here. You're going to quote what the argument is if you're doing this chart. You're going to identify what the evidence is. And see, he wrote this very smoothly. So he references what has there been of the conduct of the British ministry in the last 10 years to justify those hopes, right? So he adds that in so smoothly that you almost don't think it's an argument, but it is. He's definitely saying, how could you have faith that this is going to turn out well for you? Look at the last 10 years. That is an argument. The argument is things are not going to turn out well. And his evidence is the past 10 years. Look at what has happened. So you really have to be able to listen and pay attention to what is happening in the text so that you can identify arguments like these that are kind of woven into each other and break it down. I am definitely going to go through this paragraph by paragraph when we read, but it's also important for you to take a little extra time to also comb over what it is that we've gone through after you have the understanding of what the text means, so that you can break things down like this to answer the lesson activities and have a better time dealing with the mastery test. If you feel the need to write down translations for anything that I've said in this video, feel free to put that in your notes, because it might help you with the mastery test later. Alrighty, so the link to crisis number 1 is here at the bottom, and we are just gonna, I'm just highlighting it so people can see where it is, and we are just gonna pop that open and here. Now this looks very, 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 very long, but it is not that long. This is the last paragraph here. And even though this language is from the revolutionary days, and some of that language is difficult to understand normally, Thomas Paine writes in a straightforward manner. So this is a little easier to get than some of the other things that you've read from the last lesson or the lesson before on colonial literature. So hopefully it won't take us too long to get through this. All right. So this says The Crisis Number 1 by Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809. And the date specifically for this piece of writing is December 23rd, 1776. These dates here are just the lifespan of Thomas Paine, basically. So these are the times that try men's souls. So when he says try here, he's referring to try as in a trial, like a test. So that kind of helps with understanding at least the hint of the meaning he has here. These are the times that test men's souls, right? So if you're being tested, it means you're going through a challenge, right? Something difficult. It says here, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in his crisis, shrink from the service of the country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. So this sentence, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, these are metaphors. Summer is a season that comes and goes. Sunshine is a type of weather that comes and goes. So if you've ever heard of the phrase like fair weather friends, or people that only stick around when things are good, right? So this is what he's referring to here. Since the weather and the seasons come and go, he's saying that uh, patriots, so people who are summer soldiers and sunshine patriots, people who support the war but are wishy-washy about it, they are going to shrink or move away from the surface of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. So basically, he's saying if you're a wishy-washy soldier and you're considering deserting or leaving the army because things are hard, um, basically you're not real. Like you're not actually loyal. And that the people who are standing by the soldiers in the army now that things are difficult are the people who deserve the love of the men and women of this country. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Again, this is fairly simple. So tyranny is when someone is abusing their power, right? Someone at the top is abusing their power. And he's comparing the process of having someone abuse their power on you to hell. So it's not easily conquered or overcome. And then he says, but we have this consolation. Consolation is a comfort, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. So he's saying this is very difficult, but if we can get through to the end and we can win, our triumph is going to be even sweeter. It's going to be greater. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. So what he's saying here is that if you get something easily and you don't have to fight for it, you basically don't value it as much as you should. And that it's dearness that gives everything its value. So the things that you fight hard for are the things that you actually value the most. And he's basically making this point to argue that, yes, fighting for freedom for America is hard, but it's something that is actually worthwhile. And if we have to fight for it, then we're going to care for it just as much because of everything we had to sacrifice to get it. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. So at this point, he kind of calls upon, like some religious discussion here. So heaven, obviously, up above, knows how to put a price on its goods. So he's saying with that sentence that freedom is a heavenly thing, and that obviously it's very valuable because of that. Anything associated with heaven should be highly rated, especially if you are a religious person. So Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us all in all cases, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? So if we underline this, bind us in all cases whatsoever, this is a reference to the British Declaratory Act of 1766, which stated that the British government had the same authority to tax in the American colonies as it did in Britain. So this is part of what kicked off people wanting to separate from Britain, the foundation for all of the taxes that were there. So Paine is just explaining that Britain is using their army to enforce their abuse of power. And then he gives you the definition of what that abuse of power is, right? They're declaring that they have the right to tax and bind everyone in all cases whatsoever to pay those taxes. That's the language that was in the law when it was passed. And he compares that to slavery. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon the earth? So he's definitely saying that enslaving the colonists who built the colonies is wrong, because they should deserve the opportunity to pursue their own goals in the colonies because they built the colonies. Without those people to colonize for them and establish the cities and networks that are there, the Americas wouldn't even exist. So even the expression is impious, for so limited a power can only belong to God. So what he's saying is impious is not religious or lacking respect, right, for religious practices. So what he's saying here is that to use language like to bind us in all cases whatsoever is a power that only God can exhibit. So only God can bind people in all cases whatsoever. Because if you're religious, you believe that God is all seeing, all knowing, and is ever present, right? So he's basically just making the point that the language that they use is too forceful and too overreaching. They're basically trying to impose on them the way that God would impose themselves on somebody. And he's making the statement here that it is disrespectful to do that because only God has a limited power like that. So he's basically trying to make the connection that the British monarchy and the people passing laws are acting as God. And since they are not literally God, they're also in violation of just like general religious respect, etiquette, and practices. So if you're claiming to be like God, usually you're not in the right. Most religious people agree that only God has the power to be like God. So if you're trying to put yourself in that position, you're usually corrupt or greedy or other unsavory things. So here in the second paragraph we have, whether the independence of the continent was declared too soon or delayed too long, I will not now enter into an argument. My own simple opinion is that if it had been 8 months earlier, it would have been much better. So he kind of opens. He says he's not going to make an argument, but he does state his opinion. So he does make a claim. So he says he's not gonna. This first part of the sentence basically says that he's not going to make an argument about if the independence of America was declared too soon or delayed too long, because this was a discussion that people were having at the time. So he just says, my simple opinion is that if it had been 8 months earlier, it would have been much better. And then he says, we did not make a proper use of last winter. Neither could we while we were in a dependent state. However, the fault, if it were one, was all our own. We have none to blame for ourselves. So he's saying here that the reason why he feels, and this is one of the arguments that's being made. It's a smaller one, but he is making it. He thinks that the independence of the country should have been declared 8 months earlier. And this is because most people do not fight during the winter, right? It's harder to move in snow. Like you can fight in winter, but usually when you're warring with another state or country or people, the winter is either a time where everyone rests to recuperate because the snow makes it difficult to travel and fight, or where if there is fighting, it's very slow to break out. Like at this time, you have to remember there weren't, like cars or tanks or any of these things. So fighting in the winter was more of a risk for both sides in a bad way. You would end up with people dying from frostbite, like for the most part, war tended to kind of lull in the winter, right? But because they did not declare independence before the winter, they couldn't use that season to prepare, is basically what he's saying. So this is a logical argument. He's saying it would have been better if they did it 8 months ago because they would have had winter to prepare for the fighting that they're doing now. And he says that this is the fault of all our own. So he's saying that the British aren't to blame for that. We could have made better decisions and we didn't. And then he says, but no great deal is lost yet. So he's acknowledging for the people, that might have been criticizing the war and the losses that they've been taking on. Like, yes, we could have done things better. In my opinion, I think we could have done things better. But not everything is lost yet, right? All that Howe has been doing for this month past is rather a ravage than a conquest. which the spirit of the Jerseys a year ago would have quickly repulsed, and which time and a little resolution will soon recover. So Howe here is referencing the commander for the British forces. So basically, he was fighting a campaign through New England, and he managed to push the soldiers back across the Delaware River. And he refers to all of this that the British has been doing is a ravage rather than a conquest. So he's saying they aren't just trying to take over the colonies to stop them from from obtaining freedom and independence. He's basically just massacring everyone. That's the implication here, that he's being more violent than he has to be. Like, it's about sending a message. And then he says, which the spirit of the Jersey, so this is referring to New Jersey, up until 1702, the New Jersey was East Jersey and West Jersey. So they're giving you the history of that. This is just what they're referred to because they used to be two separate colonies. So they're saying that even though Howe has been ravaging their soldiers, if they had declared independence earlier, the Jerseys a year ago would have repulsed the fighting, repulsed us to drive back, and which time and little resolution will soon recover. So it says here that they're definitely going to push back now and recover what they've lost to Howe. But he's just making the point that if they had declared independence 8 months ago and had the time to prepare, the Jerseys or the militias, the armies that were in the Jerseys area would have been able to push back Howe's forces. So he's making direct commentary on how the war has actually gone and the resources that were available. The soldiers in the Jerseys would have had more resources and more ways to push back the British if they had more time to prepare, is basically what he's saying in this paragraph. So he's acknowledging some of the shortcomings of the war. And the reason why he's doing this is because he's ramping up to try to tell people, hey, we've had some shortcomings and not everything was great, but it's actually important for us to still fight anyway, even though these mistakes have been made. That's basically what he's gearing up to say. So in this next paragraph, I have as little superstition in me as any man living, but my secret opinion has ever been and still is that God Almighty will not give up a people to military destruction or leave them supposedly to perish, who have so earnestly and so repeatedly sought to avoid the calamities of war by every decent method which wisdom could invent. Okay, so this is a longer sentence. We're going to try to break it down. So he says, I have as little superstition in me as any man living. So he's saying, I'm not a superstitious person. And then he says, but my secret opinion has ever been. So if you've noticed, he's noted his opinion. He's kind of downplaying his opinion, even though he has very strong opinions. In the earlier paragraph, he said, my own simple opinion. In this paragraph, he's saying, my secret opinion, right? So he's trying to talk to people as if he's just some other man that just has an opinion. But he clearly has very strong thoughts and he's trying to back them up with evidence and the knowledge that he has. So that's important to know. And then he gives you the opinion, which is that God will not give up a people to military destruction or leave them to perish if you've repeatedly sought to avoid war. So what he's saying here is it's his personal belief, even though he's not suspicious, that God knows if you're trying to avoid fighting, that you're doing the right thing. He's saying that even his religious beliefs back the idea that they're going to win the war. Now, this is a weaker argument. At least in modern day, it would be. At this time, a lot of people were religious in New England and the colonies. So this was a bigger piece of evidence and argument or claim, point to be made, whatever you want to call it, than we would say it is today. This, I think a lot of people would take as a logical argument because they would agree that like God supports peace. So if you try to resolve an issue in a peaceful manner, then you would be blessed by God. I think most people would agree with that at the time. And what he's referring to is the fact that the colonies at this point before the Revolutionary War, sent a lot of representatives to Britain to argue for the independence of the colonies in the Americas, to try to strike deals, to try to cut back on the amount of taxes, but still be under Britain. And basically, Britain's response was, no, we're not going to accept anything other than like complete and utter like servitude to the country, because you're all British citizens. So you have to be taxed like everyone else. Some of the taxes that were levied or doled out to the people felt like they were being done out of spite, because people were frustrated with having to pay them in the first place, and just were kind of making these arguments. And I mean, things kind of went back and forth with the American colonies sort of like pulling petty pranks and forcing the British to lose money on things to try to discourage them from taxing them. And it just ended up culminating or adding up into war. So he's referring to the fact that representatives from America have tried to peacefully negotiate America's freedom to the British for years before this war broke out. And he's saying that if we tried so hard to just get this without having to fight, then God's going to support us because we took the peaceful route or tried to, and we're only fighting because we're being forced to. Neither have I so much of the infidel in me. Infidel is like a heathen, someone who is not loyal. So neither have I so much of the infidel in me as to suppose that he has relinquished the government of the world and given us up to the care of devils. And I cannot see on what grounds the King of Britain has to look up to heaven for help against us, a common murderer, a highwayman, a housebreaker, has as good as pretense as he. So what's happening here is he's developing this argument further, right? So he's saying that when he says that neither have I so much as infidel in me. So he's saying, I'm faithful to God. I don't have any dissent or, like disloyalty to God in me. And because of that, I'm not going to pretend or fall into the belief that God has just given up on us and is going to let us suffer. And he, says to the care of devils. So he's referring to the British government and rule as the care of devils. So he's saying that because he's faithful in his belief that God supports people who are about obtaining peace, he can't believe that God is giving up on them. Because that would make him disloyal to the concept of God supporting people who do what they're supposed to do, living peacefully. And then he finishes it off by saying, I cannot see on what grounds the King of Britain can look up to heaven for help against us. So he's saying that the British government also claims to be Christian, but I can't see how they could ask God to help them crush the Americans in war, given that they've tried so many times peacefully to get their independence. And then he makes a comparison. He says, a common murderer, a highwayman, or a housebreaker has as good a pretense as he. So he's saying that anybody who is a murderer, a highwayman is like a highway robber person, like bandits, or a housebreaker, someone that breaks into homes, like a criminal. He's saying criminals have the same right that the King of Britain do to ask for help against his enemies. And that's saying a lot. He's directly comparing the King of Britain to criminals and saying he doesn't even have the right to ask God for help in this war the same way that we do, because we approached it peacefully and they did not. So why would God be on their side? And he's saying that because he's loyal to God and he knows that God supports the correct side, he knows that the Americans are going to be protected in the war because they are the ones who tried to do this peacefully. Now, if we hover over this question, it says, how might you reword this sentence if you were writing this essay using contemporary language? Now, remember, this is the sentence where he says, I'm not superstitious, but my secret opinion is that God won't give up a people to military destruction, right? So like war, or leave them to perish or be destroyed, right? That have tried so many times to avoid war. It says by every decent method which wisdom could invent. So he's saying by literally every way that a smart person could think of to try to avoid war, that's what we've done. So they're asking, how would you put this in like modern English? And I've kind of done some of the work for you, but you should think about how you would put this if you were explaining this like to another person. Okay, next paragraph. I once felt all that kind of anger, which a man ought to feel against the mean principles that are held by the Tories. Now, the Tories are considered like the loyalists, um, basically people who are loyal to the crown. And I think that he's referring not just to British people who are loyal to the crown, but also Americans who are loyal to the crown as well, who didn't want the war. Because there are some people in America who are just like, oh, we shouldn't fight. We're just going to lose so many people. It's not worth it. So I think he's addressing these people here. A noted one who kept a tavern in Amboy was standing at his door with as pretty a child in his hand, about 8 or 9 years old, as I ever saw. And after speaking his mind as freely as he thought was prudent, so that's wise and practical manners. So this is a man with his child, finished with his unfatherly expression of, "Well, give me peace in my day." So he's giving an example here. So he's saying that he felt anger at people that were like this, and he's giving us an example. This is like an anecdote, right? Um, so this is the quote that he's saying this person had. They lectured their 9-year-old kid, and then at the end said, "Well, give me peace in my day." So it says, "Not a man lives on this continent, but fully believes that a separation must sometime or other finally take place. And a generous parent should have said, if there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace. And this single reflection, well applied, is sufficient to awaken every man to duty." Okay, so let's explain this. This is like a set of sentences that are hard to understand if you don't do them all together. So he's saying that he feels anger, um, and it's righteous anger, so which a man ought to feel. Ought to means supposed to. So he's saying that he has a right to feel anger at this, and he's feeling anger towards the principle. Now, the principle that he's talking about is like a way of thinking, right? A type of character and belief. So that's what he means. So principles are like personal rules that you have for yourself, or things that you believe personally to be true. And to give you an example of what this principle is, he talks about this man who kept a tavern, who says with his child holding his hand, "Well, give me peace in my day." So Thomas Paine's argument after this is that everyone in this everyone in this continent believes that a separation has to happen at some point. So basically, no matter what people want in terms of the war, most people believe that America should be separate from Britain at some point. Even if it's not now, most people believe they should separate at some point. And he's saying that if you were a generous parent that actually cared about your children, you would say, if there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace, and that this should awaken every man to duty. So let's break that down. If there must be trouble, let it be in my day that my child may have peace. So this is the idea of saying things are difficult now, but I would rather things be difficult for me as an adult than for my child to suffer. So let's resolve the issue now so that everyone that comes after me can live better. That's basically what this is saying. So Thomas Paine is saying that this is a better way to think about the war rather than what the man was saying, give me peace in my day. Thomas Paine is basically saying, you're an adult, you've got a business, you're keeping a tavern. At this point, you've reached some of the peak of your life already. So why wouldn't you fight so that your children can have a better America, a better experience in the colonies? And he's saying that idea of fighting now so that your children don't have to fight later should awaken every man to do. And the question that they ask here is, why does Paine tell this story in the first part of this paragraph? So we're going to get into the rest of it. Not a place upon earth might be so happy as America. So no other place has the potential to be as happy as America can be if it's free, is the part that he's not saying. Her situation is remote from all the wrangling world, and she has nothing to do but to trade with them. So they're saying that this particular colony, this set of colonies, America, is in a different situation than almost any other country or situation before, like in terms of the leverage to have revolution, in terms of like the trade and the culture that they've been able to cultivate there, the cities that they've been able to settle, and the trade that they've been able to do, the wealth they've been able to accrue and be sufficient on their own. Like at this point, America is almost independent from Britain entirely. It is still just being forced to pay taxes, even though its population is growing and growing and growing. And there's so many different cultures coming together at this point. At least that's how they viewed it back then. So it says a man can distinguish himself between temper and principle. So a man can differentiate or tell the difference between temper, so like how they're feeling, and principle, which is what they believe. And I am as confident as I am, that God governs the world, that America will never be happy until she gets clear of foreign dominion. So dominion is like control or rule. So he's saying that America's in a unique position, and America is possibly has a potential to be the happiest place on earth. But also that America will never be happy until it's fully independent. Like it just won't be the best it can be while it's under Britain. And he's saying that a man can distinguish himself between temper and principle. So he's saying that this isn't just a feeling. This is something that he absolutely knows personally to be the correct thing from what he's seen about what America is capable of. Wars without ceasing will break out until that period arrives, and the continent must in the end be conqueror. For although the flame of liberty may cease to shine, the coal can never expire. So what he's saying here is that it's his personal belief that wars and conflict will continue to break out between America and the British until America is independent. And this ties back into what he's saying before in the anecdote, right? About the man talking about wanting peace, right? If we know that the fighting is going to continue to break out between America and Britain, especially because America has its own resources that they can, build up to try for independence over and over again. You should want to just finish the war, the conflict once and for all now, instead of like wishing or pushing your children to live in a world that is so that is basically full of fighting back to back to back to back to back. And he's saying these things, they're his own opinion, but he thinks that these are observations that everyone can see. Just to tie this back into what was said earlier, when he talks about the taxes, right? They've been the American colonies have been fighting with Britain for 10 years, which is already a long time going back and forth. And I mean, technically, even before that, this was just when the law was passed that said it was legal for Britain to tax America this way. But it's really been going back and forth for even longer than that. So these are the things that Thomas Paine is referencing when he's talking about believing that wars will continue to break out until America becomes independent. And then at the end here, he says, for though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the coal can never expire. So he's using this as a metaphor, and they ask you this question: what metaphor is Paine using here? Now, we've pretty much explained the logic. This previous part of the sentence, wars without ceasing will break out until that period arrives. So without ceasing, without stopping. And the continent, so you say America, the main landmass, must in the end be conquered. So he's giving you all the pieces for this metaphor here. Even if you're able to beat back the forces that are asking or demanding freedom, it won't stop anyone from trying completely. So that's what he's saying with this metaphor. Okay, so we only have a few paragraphs left, and they are a little chunky, but I think we can get through them. So it says here, I turn with the warm ardor, which is warmth and passion, of a friend to those who have nobly stood and yet are determined to stand the matter out. So he's saying he's uh, turning with the warmth and passion of a friend or an encourager of people who continue to stand for America's independence. I call not upon a few, but upon all, not on the state, this state or that state, but on every state. Up and help us. Lay your shoulders to the wheel. Better have too much force than too little when so great an object is at stake. So he's saying that he's turning now to everyone in the country. And he's standing there and calling on behalf of those who have been in the war, who are continuing to fight. So he's saying that he's calling upon literally everyone, not certain states, not certain people, but literally everyone, because it's better to have too many soldiers in the war to push back the British than too little. When as great an object is at stake, so he's talking about freedom. So he's saying freedom is the great object that they are fighting for. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and repulse it. So he's saying he wants it to be said in the future, right? The depth means like deep in the winter. So even though they could have spent that winter preparing, and they didn't, because of when independence was declared, he still wants everyone to get up and come out. And he wants this to be a story of triumph, right? So when everyone thought things would be bad and America would lose to the British, he feels that if we all band together, that it would be a noble and glorious story for the future, for people to be able to say their odds were slim, but everyone came together to beat back the British. The British is the common danger that everyone's alarmed about. Say not that thousands are gone. Turn out your tens of thousands. So he's saying, don't focus on the people who have died. Contribute more people to the war to guarantee victory. Throw not the burden of the day upon providence, but show your faith by your works, so that God may bless you. So there's a reference here. So throw not the burden of your day upon providence. Basically, don't blame fate or the spirit of America itself as the reason why people are suffering. Don't just leave things into the hands of a higher power, right? So providence is the spirit of America. This is how people have been referring to it. It's basically like the muse, the guiding spirit of the war. That's what they called it. They called it providence. So don't rely on providence to get you out of the situation, but show your faith by your works, is what they're saying. So throw not the burden of the day upon providence means don't just say, like, Lord, take care of it and leave it there. He goes on to say, show your faith by your works. So this is a passage from the Bible. He's saying, don't just hope that things are going to get better. Be part of the force that makes it better so that God can bless you. Because if you're not doing anything, then you won't be able to receive the blessing that will help everyone else. It matters not where you live or what rank of life you hold. The evil or the blessing will reach you all. So now he's moving into other things, right? So he's talking about the evil or the blessing. What he's saying here is that the outcome of the war is going to affect everyone no matter what. No matter where you live or how much money you have, if the British win, you're going to feel the impact of that. If America wins the war, you're going to feel the impact of that. So now he's getting into being a little more forceful with his argument. He's starting to lean into or ease into reasons why you should band together. So he's not just calling upon people to help. He's moving into here's why. The far and near, the home countries and the back, the rich and the poor will suffer or rejoice alike. The heart that feels not now is dead. The blood of his children will curse his cowardice, who shrinks back at a time where little might have saved the whole or made them happy. So now, he's getting into more of an emotional kind of appeal, right? So he starts off with making the very logical point, which is that no matter what happens, you're going to feel it if you're rich or poor, if you're from like the coast or if you're in the further back within the colonies. But then he moves into the emotional part. The heart that feels not now is dead. So he's saying if you're not going to feel for the cause now, you've basically consigned yourself to death. Like this is the do or die moment, because if we don't succeed, you might actually die based on what the British may do. And then it says, the blood of his children will curse his cowardice, who shrinks back at a time when a little might have saved the whole and made them happy. So the point he's making here is that if everyone contributes a little, the army will have a lot and they'll be able to go to victory with that. And that if you're one of the people who is like a coward, your children will know that you were that type of person that could have contributed something to the victory of the country, and you didn't. It only takes a little from everyone contributing now to swell their numbers enough to potentially win. And he's just saying that it's worthwhile to do it now. I love the man that can smile in trouble, that can gather his strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. Tis the business of little minds to shrink, but he whose heart is firm and whose conscience approves his conduct will pursue his principles unto death. So basically, here, I love the man that can smile in trouble. So he's saying that there's a lot of people who are discouraged by how the war has been going and the losses that they've suffered, but this is not the time to run away or try to run to the British to help. Remember, he made that argument earlier he's going to make an argument later that they gave us the example of, looking at, here's how the Britons have treated us the last, 10 years. Like, so why would things get better, So this is connecting to that. He's like starting to build the foundation of that. And he says, it is the business of little minds to shrink. So this is kind of also like an emotional appeal. He's saying, if you're being a coward, then you have a little mind. But if you have a firm heart, and you know that what you're doing is the right thing, whose conscience approves of his conduct is behavior. You pursue your principles or the things you believe in until death. So he's saying that I know that this is difficult, but this is the right thing to do, and it's worth dying for. My own line of reasoning is to myself be as straight and clear as a ray of light. So he's saying that he also, his own like logic and principles are to just be straightforward about the situation and pursue what's happening, support the war to help other people. So he's comparing himself as unwavering. So he's straight and clear. So he's dead set on this path of supporting the war until death if he has to. Not all the treasures of the world, so far as I believe, could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder. But if a thief breaks into my house, burns and destroys my property, and kills or threatens to kill me or those that are in it, and to bind me in all cases whatsoever to his absolute will, am I to suffer it? So now he's leading into, he does not believe in war. He thinks that if you kill people in war, you are murdering people. But on the other hand, what else are you supposed to do if people are threatening you and your family, destroying your property, killing people who are in your home, and trying to, he references the law, the language of the law from before, bind me in all cases whatsoever. He's saying if someone comes into my house and decides to do all of these things to me, even if I don't believe in war, am I supposed to just let them do that to me? That's the point that he's making here. What signifies it to me whether he who does it is a king or a common man, my countrymen or not my countrymen, whether it be done by an individual villain or an army of them. If we reason to the root of things, we shall find no difference. Neither can just cause be assigned why we should punish in the one case and pardon in the other. So he's addressing here arguments that other people have made against the war. That's basically what he's doing. People have said like, oh, well, this isn't great, but Britain is a government and they know what they're doing. So we should just, suffer for a little bit and then try to see if we can make it better later. So he's addressing people that he knows have made this argument in this paragraph. He's saying that it shouldn't matter if the person who is imposing on you and your family and your household is a king or a common man, so a man you would see on the street. My countrymen or not my countrymen, so a neighbor or not a neighbor, or if it's an individual villain or an army of them. So he's saying that if people are doing wrong things, it's wrong no matter who they are and what rank they have. So he's basically saying that the king being a king doesn't make everything that he does the right thing. And this is directly in opposition to beliefs that some people have at the time that like kings are put in place by God. So everything they do automatically is right. And he's arguing against this and saying like, no, because God wouldn't support, remember what he said in the other paragraph above? God wouldn't support someone who's willing to bring war to people who have tried to prevent war in like every possible aspect, right? So neither can any just cause be assigned why he should punish one in one case and pardon in the other. So he's saying it doesn't make sense to treat anyone who's committing a crime differently just because they're a king. Being wrong is wrong. And I'm not gonna let people walk all over me. So then he says, let them call me rebel and welcome. I feel no concern from it. But should I suffer the misery of devils, were I to make a whore of my soul by swearing allegiance to one whose character is that of a softish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish man, I conceive likewise a horrid idea in receiving mercy from a being who at the last day shall be shrieking to the rocks and mountains to cover him, and fleeing with terror from the orphan, the widow, and the slain of America. So wow, that's a lot that he's saying there, right? We start off, okay, let them call me rebel and welcome. I feel no concern from it. So he's saying, I'm standing up for this because it's the right thing to do to stop people in power from doing terrible things. So if that makes me a rebel to criticize the king who's doing something that's clearly wrong, then they can call me a rebel. But then he goes on to say that but I should suffer, right? So he's saying, you can call me a rebel if you want, but what I'm not going to do is agree with the king just because he's the king. I'm not going to compromise my morals by swearing allegiance or pledging loyalty to someone who's clearly taking advantage of me. Like, he's basically making the point that the Bible implies, like, if you're religious, you're supposed to stand up against wrongdoing wherever it is, no matter who it's coming from. So it would be weird to be religious and to know that that's true, and then swear allegiance to someone who's doing awful things and treating people terribly just because he's a king. But then he tries to dismantle the king's character by saying, swearing allegiance to one whose character is that of a softish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish man. So he's making it very clear that he does not think that the king is a good person or guided by good principles. And he's like, what's the point of swearing allegiance to someone like that, especially if they're going to turn against you and use that specifically to abuse their power against you? Like, you aren't truly, he's basically implying that if you are truly, like a son or daughter of God, you would stand up against wrongdoing, because God supports people that does that. And the stories of the Bible that he's read support that. Then he says, I conceive likewise a horrid idea in receiving mercy from a being who at the last day shall be shrieking to the rocks and mountains to cover him and fleeing from with terror from the orphan, the widow, and the slain of America. So he says he thinks that it's a terrible idea to ask for mercy from someone who is like this, who has this sort of sottish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish character. So this is the second part of him building that argument that we saw the example of before we open this, right? If the king is already treating people badly before the war, what makes people think that he's going to show mercy to the people who don't want to fight? It doesn't make sense to expect kindness or mercy from someone whose character is bad. And that's what Thomas Paine is trying to say here. It's a horrible idea. It's a horrid idea to receive mercy from someone. And he goes on to say, someone who's going to be fleeing, that means retreating in terror, that means like scared, running scared from an orphan, a widow, and the slain of America. So he's saying that he's confident that the king is going to be on the ropes, that the Americans are going to win the war, and that it would be crazy knowing that to surrender and expect mercy from someone who's going to be dealing with the consequences of his actions very soon, is basically what he's saying here. All right, so we've got two more paragraphs. There are cases which cannot be overdone by language. So he's saying that there are certain topics that you can't overstate or overtalk about. And this is one. There are persons too who see not the full extent of the evil that threatens them. So he's saying that there are people in the country that don't understand like how evil the British king and the government is for doing what they're doing. They solace or comfort themselves with the hopes that the enemy, if he succeed, will be merciful. So this is where we're moving directly into that. It is the madness of folly. So folly is like foolishness. So he's saying it's the craziness of foolish to expect mercy from those who have refused to do justice. And even mercy, when conquest is the object, is only a trick of war. So he's saying, you know, it's foolish to expect mercy from people who are not just, who don't do the right thing. And then he goes on to say, he adds to this, and even mercy, where conquest is the object, is only a trick of war. The cunning of the fox is as murderous as the violence of the wolf, and we ought to guard equally against both. So he's saying that even if the king does promise mercy, usually it's a trick of war. Promising mercy is the thing that people do to get you to let your guard down. And then they come in, and historically, they slaughter everyone because you let them in and you had already cost them whatever it was they had to lose to get inside, right? So they're going to just conduct revenge. That's what he's implying here. And then he says the cunning of the fox, this is another metaphor. Cunning is like cleverness or wit. So basically, if you're plotting or planning a trap, he's saying it's just as murderous as the violence of the wolf. So basically, anyone who's plotting to trick you is just as dangerous as someone who's directly coming at you with force. And he's saying we have to guard against both. So he's saying that knowing the history of the British government and the army when it comes to doing other things, why would you expect this case with us to somehow be different? If their goal is to own America and conquest America, then what's going to happen is they're going to do that. And they're not going to give you mercy just because you decided not to fight. So you should be guarded, even if they were to promise you that mercy, instead of you just hoping for it, you should be wary. You should be worried and cautious about it. Howe, remember that's the general in charge of the British Army. Howe's first object is, partly by threats and partly by promises, to terrify and seduce the people to deliver up their arms and receive mercy. So he's telling you that the objective of this war general is to get people to give up their weapons so they can't defend themselves and receive mercy. Because once they have your weapons, then it doesn't really matter what they promise you, right? They can force you to do anything. The ministry recommended the same plan to Gage. So Gage here, General Thomas Gage, commander of the British forces before the Revolutionary War. And this is what the Tories, remember those are loyalists to the crown, call making peace. A peace which passeth all understanding. This is another biblical reference. So a peace which passeth all understanding indeed. So this is kind of a little bit of sarcasm. He's referencing the Bible here. So he's saying that, and this is kind of a combination of anecdotal and empirical evidence. So Thomas Paine is saying he has insider knowledge about the discussions that happened with the British Army. He knows that General Howe, is to scare the people into giving up their weapons so that he can take over their areas, right? And Thomas Paine offers the additional information that the ministry or the British government recommended the same plan to Gage, who was previously the general. And that scaring people to give up their arms is what they call making peace. So it's not enough to come to an agreement. They want to disarm everyone so that they can basically bully them or push them around since they can't defend themselves. So when he references that the Tories call this making their peace, a peace which passeth all understanding, he's being sarcastic. He's saying, obviously, this is the type of peace that they were referring to in the Bible. And you know that it's not. He means the opposite here, because telling people to give up their weapons to help with taking over America as part of the war is not peaceful, right? He means the opposite. And this also ties into what he was saying earlier about the Bible, right? And also just God supporting the side that is correct. God would support people who are doing the right thing. So him applying these biblical passages is him basically pointing out that the British really do think they're doing the right thing, but it doesn't. He's basically saying that nothing is adding up. If you really wanted to be peaceful, you would actually be peaceful instead of trying to trick people. So a peace which would be the immediate forerunner to a worse ruin than any we have yet thought of. So yeah, you give up your weapons first, and then what happens next, right? So it's not actually peace. It's just a trick. Ye men of Pennsylvania, do reason upon these things. So he's saying that, Pennsylvania is where that particular army has passed through. So think about these things a bit harder before making a decision. Were the back counties to give up their arms, they would fall easy prey to the Indians who are all armed. This perhaps is what some Tories would not be sorry for. So they're pointing out that if everyone gives up their weapons, their arms, right, they could also fall prey to the Indians. So this is a second threat. Not only could the British do whatever they want, but the Indians who have been in conflict with both the Americans and the British could swoop in knowing that the Americans don't have any weapons. And what he's implying here, like he doesn't say it directly, at least in these sentences, that if the Americans got ambushed by the Indians because they don't have weapons, pretty much the Tories or the British Army would kind of be like, well, sorry that happened. Like it's a way to set them up to potentially be injured or be taken over or ruled or die without the British having to get their hands dirty. So there's multiple threats to consider here. Thomas Paine at this point is talking strategy, like war strategy. Were the home counties to deliver up their arms, they would be exposed to the resentment of the back counties, who would have it in their power to chastise, so inflict punishment, their defection of pleasure. So pretty much, he's also adding here that if the counties give up their weapons, they might also end up fighting with the people next to them who are still trying to fight the British. So like if you have one county that's given up all their weapons and all the counties around them still have theirs and they're still trying to fight the British Army, that's probably not going to work out well for the county that gave up their weapons. So there's also that to, like you're making the area weaker for people who want to fight. And usually people don't take that very well. So that also is a thing to think about. and were one state to give up its arms, that state must be garrisoned by all Howe's army of Britons and Hessians. So these are German soldiers that are fighting for the British, to preserve it from the anger of the rest. So he's pointing out even more strategy related things. If you have a state or county give up its arms, right? That means that the British are going to have to occupy it with their soldiers to protect it from all of the outside threats potentially. So there's lots of different types of outcomes that could happen. The British could punish everyone after they give up their weapons. The people from these areas could fall prey to the Indians, who are already hostile because of how things have gone down between the Americans, the British, and the Indians. They could also deal with the resentment of their neighbors who are still fighting, who are, you know, like bitter that they gave up their that they gave up their weapons and made things harder for people still fighting in the war. And there's also the issue of the state or county having to be occupied by all the soldiers of the British to protect it from these threats. And it is possible that there could be some resentment from the soldiers that are there. So, like, he's making the argument that giving up your weapons is not going to lead to peace, right? Remember the sarcasm, a peace with passeth all understanding? He's saying there's nothing peaceful about this. Here are all of the things that could happen as a result of you giving up your weapons because you don't want to fight and you want to get on the Britain's good side. You want to get on the British Army's good side. None of these are peaceful. None of these outcomes are peaceful, and these are all the likely outcomes. So he's making logical arguments here with the evidence of just things that happen in war and what he knows about strategy and being a tactician. Mutual fear is the principal link in the chain of mutual love, and woe be to that state that breaks the compact. So it says here, what type of appeal is Paine using in this statement? So here he's referencing fear and love, right? And then woe be to that state that breaks the compact. So mutual fear is the principal link in the chain of mutual love. So he's saying that fear of difficulties that you face together is what bonds people together in love. And woe be, so woe be is like, sadness or melancholy, right? So woe is kind of like just bad times, depression, right? So woe be to that state that breaks the compact. And compact is like an agreement, right? So if all of the counties and states have come together to defend against the British, and they've come to depend on each other and love each other more because they're all fighting the same enemy. What do you think will happen if one of the states or counties just decides, no, never mind, I'm going to turn on everyone? So that's what he's referring to when he says, woe be to that state that breaks the compact. So this is almost a threat. Howe is mercifully inviting you to barbarous destruction. So barbarous means like barbaric. And men must either be rogues or fools. So rogues are people who have no loyalty, thieves, or fools that do not see it. I dwell not upon the vapors of imagination. I bring reason to your ears, and in language as plain as ABC, hold the truth up to your eyes. So he finishes this paragraph basically by saying, this is a trap. I said it once before, but I'm just going to say it again in like plainer language, that you might be being offered mercy, but it won't be mercy for real. And you have to be dumb to not notice it. And this is after he's pointed out all the ways that it is not peaceful at all. So he says he's not going to dwell on the imagination of what else could happen. And he's just telling you in plain language all the things that are likely. So then we have this last paragraph. I thank God that I fear not. I see no real cause for fear. I know our situation well, and I can see the way out of it. So he's kind of piggybacking off of the information that he's put in the last paragraph, right? Thomas Paine is clearly, He's been traveling with the army. He can clearly see strategy. So he's relying on the information that he gave everyone before to sort of assert his authority. He's like, I'm clearly smart. I know what's going on. I know how war works. And based on all of those things and my belief in God, I know the situation that we're in and that it seems scary, but I can see a way out of it. And if you're a person from like this era who's reading this, you might look at the paragraph above where he's listing all of the things that could happen if one of the counties or states gives up their weapons and think, oh wow, he's smart to think ahead like that. Maybe he does know what he's talking about. So he's building on that. And he's saying, basically, he's implying, trust me, I clearly know what I'm talking about. While our army was collected, Howe dared not risk a battle. And it is no credit to him that he decamped from the White Plains and waited a mean opportunity to ravage the defenseless Jerseys. So he's saying here that Howe didn't want to fight the American army when they were collected and organized. And he says it's no credit to him, so he doesn't get any credit. It is not to his. It is not something that's good for him that he decamped. So that means left the White Plains and waited for a mean opportunity to ravage or attack the defenseless Jerseys. So he's saying that yes, maybe Howe was able to take over the Jerseys, but they were defenseless. There wasn't an army there. And the fact that Howe didn't fight our army while we were together and went to a place that didn't have any defenses to take over shows not that he's great, but that we're great. It is great credit to us that with a handful of men, we sustained an orderly retreat for nearly 100 miles, brought off our ammunition, all our field pieces, the greatest part of our stores, and had 4 rivers to pass. So he's saying that anyone can attack someone or a space that's defenseless, right? But the strategy that it takes to orderly retreat from a place where you don't have enough soldiers, and to bring all of your ammunition and like the war pieces, field pieces, in the greatest part, so most of their weapons and stores, when they had to pass 4 rivers, shows that they're resourceful. So he's, pointing out, well, the American army had the hardest thing to do, and we were able to do it successfully. Meanwhile, Howe, head of the British Army, is picking off easy targets. So that tells you, basically, they don't want the smoke, right? They're not actually trying to fight for real. They're just trying to take the easiest spots to try to help them out because they know they can't take us on directly. None can say that our retreat was precipitate. So it wasn't sudden. It was an organized retreat that was agreed upon. For we were near 3 weeks in performing it, that the country might have time to come in. Twice we marched back to meet the enemy and remained out until dark. So he's saying you can't say that we retreated like because we were scared or anything like that. It was an organized retreat that we decided to do on purpose because it was the most strategic thing to do. So he's making the argument here that even though they weren't able to defend the Jerseys the way they wanted to, and they had to retreat, it was a retreat that benefited them instead of just the army getting scared and panicked and running. So he's trying to make the argument that even if they had to pull back and retreat, they marched back twice to meet the enemy to keep them from pursuing them. And it says, and remain till dark. So they were able to keep the British army off of them while they were retreating. And that shows a lot of skill. The sign of fear was not seen in our camp. It had not some of the cowardly and disaffected inhabitants spread false alarms through the country. The Jerseys had never been ravaged. So he's saying that the part of the reason why Howe went for the Jerseys is because there were people whispering and rumoring, basically that their army was weak, and that people were defenseless, in Jersey. But the issue was numbers. They didn't have the numbers to fully fight Howe's army, and they had to retreat. So he's pretty much saying no one was afraid, and the only reason why we didn't have enough time to prepare is because rumors basically pointed Howe towards the jerseys before we were ready. Once more, we are again collected and collecting. Our new army at both ends of the continent is recruiting fast, and we shall be able to open up the next campaign with 60,000 men, well armed and clothed. So these are facts, right? So at this point, he's just giving us, I was there, I saw what happened. Here is what happened. We were not scared. The retreat was well planned. We were retreating for 3 weeks. We knew where we were going. We were able to bring all the important things that we needed to continue fighting with us. And given the numbers that Thomas Paine knows are going to be joining the army, he's giving people facts. We should be able to open the next campaign with 60,000 men armed and well armed and clothed. So they're in a good situation. So this is our situation, and who may know it? By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious issue. By cowardice and submission, the sad choice of a variety of evils, a ravaged country, by a depopulated city, inhabitants without safety and slavery without hope, our homes turned into barracks and body houses for Hessians, and a future race to provide for, whose fathers we shall doubt of. Look on this picture and weep over it. And yet, if there remains one thoughtless wretch who believes it not, let him suffer it unlamented. So he's closing out, right? So he's given us all this information. He starts off soft at the top, right? He gives you, here are the moral and ethical reasons why you should support the war. And then as he gets lower down, he starts getting into, here are reasons why, at the very least, you shouldn't believe or support the crown because they're terrible. And he, like talks about the king and the king's character and the basically the trickery that the armies are trying to put upon the states and counties. And then he finishes with, here are hard numbers. If those first two things weren't enough to have you believe in the strength of the principles of this war, let me explain to you that our army is not like depleted. We're not running out of soldiers. We're recruiting. We did have to retreat, but it was on our own terms because we knew we weren't ready, and we would rather retreat than lose a bunch of soldiers. So we're recollecting. We're getting ourselves together again, and everyone is in good condition. We're in good spirits. So we're definitely going to win the war. This wasn't like some pathetic defeat the way that people are rumoring. We had to retreat, but it was worth it. We were able to bring our stuff with us. We were able to keep the enemy off of us so we could get to our destination. And we're going to start the next campaign of the fight with numbers. So we're going to win this war. And we're definitely going to win it if everyone comes together to support. So he closes all of this out by saying, this is our situation, and who will know it may, and who will may know it. By perseverance, that means pushing through, and fortitude, that means like endurance. We have the prospect of a glorious issue. So a glorious issue, he's saying we have the prospect, the opportunity of a glorious issue. So he's saying because of all of the hard work we've put in, and we've been persevering, pushing through, the issue that we have is a good one. So it says, by cowardice and submission, the sad choice of a variety of evils. So he's listing, here's our choices. Our choices are all these bad things. A ravaged country, so that's like a destroyed country. A depopulated city. Inhabitants without safety, and slavery without hope, right? So he's basically saying all the things that we have to choose from are bad. He goes on to say another thing is our homes turn into barracks and body houses for Hessians. So those are German soldiers that are fighting for Britain. And a future race to provide for, whose fathers we shall doubt of. So basically, if we let the British win and we let them populate our towns, they're going to become part of our society. They're going to be the next elders of our cities. We're never going to be able to trust them based on how they've betrayed us and the way that they've treated us all the way up to this point. So he's basically saying, is this or freedom? If you don't want any of these other things, then like freedom is it. And this is a glorious issue, is what he's saying. It's an easy choice. Who wouldn't want freedom when all of the alternatives are these other terrible things? So then he says, look on this picture. So that's a description of what they have to look forward to, all these terrible things. Look at this picture and weep over it. And yet, and if there yet remains one thoughtless wretch who believes it not, let him suffer it unlamented. So he says, basically what he's saying, if there remains one thoughtless wretch, so one person, one awful person who doesn't think that this is what's going to happen, let him suffer it without anybody feeling bad for him. That's what unlimited means. So he started off kind of soft, with the my simple opinion, with the here's my secret opinion. And then he kind of like builds and builds his passion for this war and explains why he thinks it's great for the country to do this, why he thinks it's worth it for the country to do this, why it's morally right, why it's ethically right, why it wouldn't be worth it to let Britain continue to take advantage of them. And then he moves into, and we're going to win anyway. We're doing great. We're recruiting people. We've got the strategy that we need. We're being led by people who know what they're doing. The strategy that's here is working. So if you're looking at this situation after everything that I've said about how terrible this situation could be if we don't fight for our freedom, and you just don't believe it, then I hope that you have to deal with the consequences and that nobody will feel bad for you when you do. So there you go. That is the crisis number one. And I mean, like, it's a pretty passionate, like argument for fighting within the war to free yourself from Britain. So I'm going to take a moment to go over some of the analysis just to wrap everything up. I know that this was a long video, but I wanted to make sure everyone understands what's going on here. So on slide 16, this is where we start the analysis. I'm not going to go over everything that's here because we did sort of go over it, right? But just to point out important things, the point obviously was to persuade the readers to the importance of declaring independence, right? And he had access to information that most citizens didn't because he was traveling with the Continental Army. So he's telling the regular everyday people about the Army's condition, and he uses empirical. Empirical basically means like evidence that you can't really argue, like facts, right? So he uses a lot of anecdotes and empirical evidence to support the goal of inspiring the American colonists to support the cause of the American Revolution. And this is that last section that we just read where he's explaining here's the alternatives, right? The glorious issue, homes turned into barracks and body houses. Body houses just means like temporary shanty towns. I'm sorry, I didn't go over that earlier. So basically temporary housing for soldiers. Paine's reference to specific numbers in this excerpt from the reading is an example of empirical evidence. So the factual evidence. He uses this to prove that the Continental Army is growing and replenishing itself. This information supports his argument that General Washington's forces are well prepared and motivated. So that's what he's doing. He's like, I'm here, I'm reporting the news, this is exactly what's happening. However, the analysis points out something important. However, pay careful attention to the reliability of information. For instance, where did Paine receive the data regarding the having 60,000 men? Paine is a fervent supporter of the American Revolution, so he might have a reason to be biased in his analysis, right? So we don't have any evidence of him counting anyone. We can't, he's not saying, I've looked at the paperwork, right? He's just saying, I was there, and this is how many soldiers we have. So even though he's stating this is what he knows to be true, right? There's no way to verify it. And it's important to note that he doesn't have a source that you can look at and say, yes, there were this many soldiers. He uses the number to try to bolster people's confidence. And I'm not saying that he's lying per se, but that there's no records backing up what he's saying. So you have to consider that since he's passionate about the war, that he might potentially be padding the numbers a little to make it seem stronger than it is. It's possible that he could be telling the truth, but the idea is that without the paperwork to back it up, we don't know. Let's see, is that okay. So on slide 18, they continue the analysis, right? So he writes the first part in a matter-of-fact tone. Matter-of-fact is like, oh, this is how it is, right? So he gives you information that he's gathered while traveling with the troops. But later in the essay, he discusses the states of the colonies, and he gives his opinion on the status of the army and the colonies as a whole, right? And we talked about this, how he softballs his opinion, phrases like my own simple opinion and my little opinion, right? My secret opinion, that kind of thing. He presents his opinions humbly, but he strongly believes in his views, and you can tell by how he talks later on. And he uses his access to information to rally the colonists against the British. So he's definitely trying to inspire them to believe in um, the war, maybe a little more than they would have normally. And then here, with the opening line of "These are times that try men's souls." Remember, try is like a trial, a challenge. Paine acknowledges the difficult and immense situation that the American colonists are facing. He thinks that the colonists are taking part in a crucial historical event. And the way that he talks about it makes it clear. He talks about how it's a situation that no one else has been in before. They're in a unique position. So he recognizes in that first paragraph that it's hard for the colonists to revolt against the British king. But even though it's hard, the reward is worth the sacrifice. And the way that he put this is we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. And then he goes on to talk about how freedom is worth that. I think that is about it. Yes. So this is the lesson activity. And I do want to take some time to go over, at least read through the questions. So now that we know what his reasoning was and things that he said, you should have an easier time answering these questions. So what was his purpose in writing the crisis number one? We kind of went over that on the analysis slides. Who were the members of his target audience, and what were the main opinions that he expressed? I feel like most of those things we've gone over. So you should be able to answer this question easy. So in the essay, the crisis number one, what ideas or events does Paine use to persuade his audience that the American colony should seek independence? Use textual evidence to support your response. So it should be 1 to 2 paragraphs in length. So when they say textual evidence, they mean you should be able to quote certain things that he said. Now, what events does he use to persuade the audience, right? He references quite a lot of events in that essay. He mentions a lot of things that the British have done. He references a lot of events just in terms of like what the army has been doing and their movements. And he mentions a lot of things about what the king has done or decided to do. And all of these, I think, even just in the first half of the crisis number one, you should have at least 1 or 2 quotes that you can use for this answer. Cite one example. So cite means they want you to provide another quote from the crisis number one in which Paine uses anecdotal evidence to support his argument. So they are not looking for a specific one. They just want anything. So remember, an anecdote is like a truthful story, a story based in truth. Use textual evidence to explain how Paine uses this anecdotal evidence. He uses so many anecdotes. You should be able to pull one. We've gone over quite a few. If you need to rewind the video and go through the paragraphs, I've pointed out most of the anecdotal evidence there. And then, based on what you've read in this lesson, describe how the political upheaval means like shakeup, during the Revolutionary era influenced the writers and intellectuals of that time. So these are things that are discussed in earlier parts of the tutorial. Like they talk about in the beginning of the tutorial outside of the reading selection, how the Revolutionary era changed people's writing. So if you're a little lost on this question, you should be able to go back to the beginning and reread some of those slides and come up with the answer for this. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing because I believe that that is everything. Okay, yes, so this was a little bit of a longer section, just because the speech itself was kind of long. And I wanted to make sure that I stopped by as many things as possible so you guys could understand. So if you have any other difficulties with going through the reading selection, please book a tutoring session with a tutor. Sometimes it helps to have someone going through it little by little with you instead of watching a video like this one, and that's perfectly okay. Contact your advocate or your mentor or your teacher, and they can hook you up with tutoring. Other than that, I hope that this video was a help to you. Thank you for watching all the way to this point. And my name is Miss Amber, and I'm gonna sign off and wish you good luck with the rest of your English class.